Hi everyone, I'm your host Kailash and welcome to this special interview series brought to you by 4C Media. As always, we are recording from our studio at the Central Campus, Christ University, Bangalore. Following the interview series that featured Madhav Gadgil and Pankaj Seksaria, in this episode, we interview Dr. Malini Ranganathan. Dr. Ranganathan is a leading voice at the intersection of urban studies, environmental justice, and anti-caste and anti-racist scholarship. Malini is a faculty member at the School of International Service at American University, Washington, D.C., and a fellow at the progressive climate policy think tank, the Climate and Community Institute. Her work examines how inequality is embedded in the very structures of our cities, from housing and water access to climate vulnerability and corruption. In the true spirit of 4C Radio, she works with climate, commons, community, and communication. In this conversation, we dwell into the work of Malini and discuss how climate justice is interconnected with other forms of power. Thank you, Malini. Thank you for being with us. Welcome to 4C Radio. Let me start by asking, how did you end up with a research agenda which is so interdisciplinary? How did you land up with this?
I started my academic life as a scientist. I was very drawn to the natural sciences because I thought that was the best discipline through which to understand environmental change. And I think as someone who came of age in the 1990s, when there was a conversation on environmental change, environmental destruction, there was global multilateral treaties happening to save ozone depletion. There was, of course, the Climate Change Convention. Mm-hmm. So I thought science might be the best way to go about that. After finishing an undergraduate degree in environmental science and chemistry from a small college in New York, I came back to Delhi and I worked for what was then known as the Tata Energy Research Institute, which then became known as The Energy. So there, I think it was the cutting edge think tank that was really focusing on questions of energy, environment, development, poverty. And I got the chance to witness discussions on environment at many different scales. So I've attended COP, Conference of Parties in Delhi. It happened in the early 2000s. But then I went to the remotest corners of Rajasthan, on villages on the outskirts of the Savai Madhopur Wildlife Sanctuary. This is like Ranthambore and other national parks in Rajasthan. These are parks that are conserved, and especially rural people are not allowed to pick firewood in these parks. So that sort of social resource conflict between villagers in Rajasthan, in the Savai Madhopur area, around firewood, cooking fuel, coal making, sparked my interest in the social dimensions of environment. And then I realized that I could not study questions of environmental change and then environmental politics, environmental justice without really retraining myself or perhaps adding to my training as a social scientist. And geography became the discipline that most attracted me because of its porous boundaries. It's not a kind of pedigree discipline that says, only geographers can be geographers. Yeah. And I think they are really appreciate and imbibe that interdisciplinary attitude, including bringing physical geographers who do remote sensing, who do, species study or whatever, chemical composition of soil, etc. They bring that to the table to look at social questions. What is critical geography? It's the study of people, power, and places, right? The interreaction between people, power, and places. And to me, that was the ideal way to understand human-environment relations.
So one of the books that you've written is Corruption Plots, where you also look at Bangalore, where we are recording this.
Yeah.
Can you just give a brief of how in Bangalore, people, power, and places, especially in the dimension of climate, how does that interact?
Corruption Plots was an unusual and a bit, I would say, a heretic disciplinary project because a team of two geographers and ultimately what also was a literary scholar who joined our team realized that, when it comes to the language of corruption, it's been hijacked by certain interests. As in, on the one hand, you have World Bank and you have Transparency International, all these global organizations that basically say corruption is, especially third world or global south states, when bureaucrats take bribes, and therefore you have to cut out the state. You have to basically dismantle the state.
Right.
The state is the source of all problems. It's a very particular post-Cold War, anti-communist agenda pushed by the West to equate, venal states, rent-seeking, etc. with corruption. We realize that actually in our current era, where you have markets in land, you have markets in food, in water, everything opening up to private sector, you also have corruption, right? And people might talk about corruption actually as the usurpation of the commons by private sector. The usurpation of the commons. If you have a lake that's suddenly being turned over to a real estate developer in Bangalore, people are calling that corruption, even though someone at KIDB might have authorized that, right? So I think then working with this more flexible, multivocal definition of corruption, we wanted to understand how is it being used as a language to understand urban, spatial, and ecological transformation. Because ultimately, ecology is the commons, right? Green space, lakes, water, so things are supposed to belong to people, govern it and according to a particular set of norms and rules. If those norms and rules are somehow flouted or they become captured by vested interests, people are calling that corruption. In fact, even the turning over of low-income land, let's EWS or slum land to private sector, is also corruption. So working with that larger spatially attuned definition of corruption, spatially and ecologically attuned definition, we thought we'd talk about what does it mean to think about corruption in the city.
So you mentioned the lakes of Bangalore.
Yes.
And in Bangalore, we have seen so many lakes dried up. I mean, Majestic was a lake before, and it was known for the lake environment which was there.
Correct.
In your research, especially at a time where there's constant encroachment by the real estate companies to take over these lands, how do you see climate change and kind of urban planning? Where do they meet? How can they solve this problem of lakes?
Right. So, there's two things I really want to mention. I think that when it comes to the discourse of encroachment, the fact is that people from all classes do it to some extent, right? You have, migrant colony that might encroach on a Rajakalway, and then you might have very big tech park also, built on some lake bund or encroaching on the buffer of the lake. But the really interesting thing here is that who gets blamed for that encroachment? Where does that tag stick and then become the basis for some sort of legal action or eviction? And you see that time and again, it is the poor, it is the marginalized where that discourse sticks the most. Because the middle class can lob that discourse at the poor and it sticks at them. It rarely can be lobbed and stuck to someone who lives in a high-story apartment building. Okay, so that's one part. So there is an uneven playing field when it comes to this encroachment. Now, that being the case, if you look at the encroachments on the natural water flows, on the what in Kannada is called kere, which translates loosely to tank or lake, you see that when you have impervious surface like concrete being built here, it doesn't allow rainwater to percolate. And especially if historically, we're talking millennia, rainwater had a way of flowing through these rivulets and you had these rain-fed Rajakalways connecting lakes, gravity-fed, going from upper levels to lower levels. Then suddenly, if you put a building in the middle of that, the water doesn't have anywhere to go. And so it immediately increases waterlogging in the area. So low-lying areas are, very, very high concentration concrete developments, like tech parks. And the famous one I bring up is Bagmani Tech Park because it's very well known in the news cycle that Bagmani Tech Park is encroaching on a storm drain. You also have Orion Mall. These large concrete things, they will somehow get the permission to go ahead and encroach. Right. And then it's easiest because the low-hanging fruit to target is the small guy. And so they'll often get big. So what happens is a disastrous mix of concretization and urban planning, which then, because of climate risk and climate endangerment, you're seeing, let's say, more intense rainfall happening within a short period of time. So this whole thing where I was saying October 22nd, 2024, where within a 24-hour period, we had not seen that kind of rain in 27 years. Now that time period is getting less and less. So we're seeing, instead of, every 50 years it comes, it's getting less and less and less. So which means that these extreme rainfall events are getting more and more frequent.
Yeah. So I'll bring the conversation to community, and you've also worked with the histories of caste oppression which have been here. Now, in Bangalore, we do see a lot of citizen initiative to save lakes coming from resident welfare associations or private associations. These are people who might not directly get affected by the destruction of the lake, but they are fighting for the commons. Yes. But there is also a caste angle there where most of these people who are fighting for these are from the upper caste, while the people who are affected are mostly from the lower caste. How do you look at these resident associations coming together in saving the lake? Do you think it's a good thing that private individuals are doing it, or do you think they should force a bit of more structural change?
I think that what we've seen happen in Bangalore, let's say starting from the early 2000s, you had not only RWAs getting much more invested in lake conservation, but also through CSR, corporate social responsibility. Lakes being to some extent privatized for boating, for jogging, and for walking around, for recreational activities. That was heavily fought by citizen groups here, especially Environment Support Group. Leo Saldana really fought the privatization of lakes, did really good exposés saying this is not actually, in many ways, it might not be most ecologically sound to preserve lakes solely for recreational purposes. So then you had, I think, a little bit of rollback of that private sector impulse, and you had RWAs really pick up. You also had big federations that were RWA members that were also being sort of bankrolled by some corporate money, etc. So you had a continuation of that private thing happening. And I would say that that's kind of what we see today, is a lot of RWAs with some corporate backing, with some federation of RWAs backing, continuing to conserve lakes, largely for these, not voting per se, but still walking and jogging. And they fence it off to slum dwellers and people who are there, who are, maybe even fishing or foraging, have a small tota by the side of the lake and are growing vegetables. So you see that those people are not allowed to use the lake. What do I mean by those people? I'm talking about marginalized castes, so people who ride around Eid might graze their goats by the lake, who are Muslim herders. You might have them using the lakes, and of course this is like the use value of the lake, right, as opposed to the exchange value, which is more commodified, right? So I think there is a need for RWAs and these middle class, upper caste people to think about the multi uses of a lake, and how do you be more inclusive and inviting to all types of groups to the lake, rather than just a kind of aesthetic, what Amitabh Bavaskar calls a bourgeois environmental approach to the lakes.
So Bangalore has always been known as, at least at one point, was the garden city. Right? And now you do see those spaces, coming down, even public open spaces. How much do you think are commons important for larger climate justice and fight in cities especially?
No, commons are tremendously important. Even using the language of economists and ecologists, there's these ecosystem values that commons provide, right? For instance, rainwater percolation, right? Water harvesting, oxygenating the city, oxygenating, public places, not to mention biodiversity. So there's so many values, but then not to mention the livelihood and economic aspects of commons as well. Historically, small tanks and small water bodies have been used by cow herders and people who grow, horticulture. The Tigala caste, who's very predominant in Bangalore, have relied very much on the relationship with tanks to grow gardens and to do horticultural work, right? So there's a livelihood dimension to commons as well. And with the erasure of commons, you're having all these ecosystem services lost, which affect climate. Climate is not the be-all and all. Like, it's not that all environmental problems are climate change, but the impacts of climate can be worsened due to other environmental problems, right? So if you don't have those ecosystems, if you don't have water percolation, then suddenly a rainstorm will cause flooding. It's that, that interactive effect that I think is very important to consider between climate and other environmental issues.
Last section which I want to talk about is, even in your book, Corruption Plots, you've taken Nancy Fraser's Counterpublic as a space, focusing on the communication part of what the radio does, right? How do you think Counterpublic within the media space can be created, and what can they actually do to assist any kind of climate fight against climate change?
It's a very important question. I really appreciate it, and a kind of close reading and application of that term, which we use as a way of signaling a collectivity that is challenging the usurpation of power, the usurpation of resources, the usurpation of space. A Counterpublic, would challenge that and also put forth a different vision for the city, right? So in terms of, your question about the media, this has never been more important. It's never been more important to stand up to the spread of disinformation and the kind of spinning that exists on mainstream news channels wherever in the world you're talking about, and the massive corporate money that is bankrolling media. And so, for me, it's been very important to the extent possible, support alternative media ventures, right? They are there. They are alive and kicking, and they do really, really important work. And so that narrative that is not captured by special interest needs to be told. It needs to be told from diverse perspectives, diverse identity positions. The media industry is badly in need of representational change. And so all of this, I think, will help to tell a story about climate justice that's really more connected with people's everyday lives. That's one of the problems of the environmental world. They tend to tell these very far removed stories of greenhouse gas emissions or sea level rise that people don't immediately connect
glaciers
to.
Melting
glaciers melting somewhere else. And that's one of the huge problems in the West, because the West has thought that climate change will only affect the third world. Now that you have wildfires happening all up and down the Pacific Northwest and flooding in Texas, activist groups who have historically been, let's say, pro-labor or pro-housing now are thinking much more about climate justice even in the West, in the United States. I think similarly, you need to have that catalyst, right, If you're experiencing it like kind of firsthand, then how do you tie climate justice to things that really matter to people's everyday life and build that communication infrastructure that's much more democratic?
Right. Lastly, Malini, if you had to give a call for action to our students, what would that be?
I mean, I think just really keep your eyes and ears open, I think once you see unjust power structures, once you see inequality, you can't unsee it, right? As some of us who sit within more privileged class, ethnic backgrounds, sometimes we are cocooned, right? But really to open your eyes and ears and to also approach these questions with like some sort of curiosity, humility, interest. Because, and this is the thing, of course, Fannie Lou Hamer's famous quote is "Nobody's free until everybody's free." This idea that actually it's not about their liberation and their welfare. It's actually very tied to your own. Right? That sense of interconnectedness, it sounds very philosophical, I know, and forgive me for that. But that sense of interconnectedness where this is not just charity work. This is not just like some abstract social justice, but actually there's a connectedness, that you have to center in your work. Something I always remind my students to do: read widely, make sure that you're getting your news from multiple sources and not just, social media. Make it a point to support alternative media, to the best of your ability. Tell stories and listen to stories, gather stories. I think even if people take a narrow career path towards advertising or commerce, I think you can still effectuate change from some of those areas, right? And change is possible in both small and bigger ways. Yeah.
Super. Thank you so much, Malini.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much for being part of this. Thank you.
There you go, folks. Our fight for climate justice, as Malini said, cannot be an isolated fight, but a fight for justice in all realms of society. This episode was edited by Srinivas Aditya, illustrated by Vernika Singh. Until next time, this is your host Kailash signing off. Remember, be curious and question everything.